science and spirituality. We must choose either science or spirituality, and for me, I never made that distinction. Even as a child growing up, I always believed that when I studied science, chemistry, geology, biology, physics, what we call science, ultimately I was studying the inner mechanism of a higher power, of a greater being.
You at some point worked for important corporations. Most of us would dream to get there, but still you left them. Why?
You know, each corporation I worked for was during a time of crisis. So Phillips Petroleum, during the energy crisis, the first energy crisis of the 1970s. Martin Marietta Defense Systems during the crisis of the Cold War years. And Cisco Systems during the early 1990s, when we had a crisis of sharing information across the computer platforms. And my role in each of those corporations was to work with the crisis, to find solutions. We're living a time of extremes. People know that something is wrong. The world of the past no longer works. We have reached a point where unsustainable ways of thinking and living have caught up with us. And so now they're saying, if the old answers don't work, what's the new answer? And I don't claim to know what the new answer is, but I believe that what science is telling us, the new discoveries, that life is not random, human life is not random, that we're deeply connected to our bodies, deeply connected to the earth. Civilization is cyclic. We have had advanced civilizations in the past that had experiences like ours that we can learn from if we have the wisdom to accept what they left. And the biology, the new biology that is telling us that nature is based upon cooperation. The problem is that that information doesn't make it into the mainstream, typically. Now, you're the exception. This is mainstream media, and we're having this conversation. But typically, the new discoveries that overturn 300 years of scientific thinking, those new discoveries are not being shared in mainstream media, mainstream documentaries, mainstream textbooks, mainstream classrooms.
Why is that?
And what that means is for the average person, we are being taught the science that is now obsolete, number one, and it's the very science that has led in many cases to the unsustainable ways of living that create the crises that we see today. So, can I give an example?
Yeah.
Charles Darwin. I'm going to talk about Darwin. I have a lot of respect for Charles Darwin as a scientist. I think he was a good scientist. And in 1859, he published his first book. And he said himself, the purpose of his book was to try to move the world beyond religion into science to explain what previously had only been explained by religious traditions. The big questions of life. Where does life come from? Where does human life come from? How do things work in this world? And Charles Darwin himself said, he said, when new discoveries overturn my theories, he said, my theories will fall, and the new discoveries will then become the new theory. So Darwin allowed and expected that his theories would fall. But today, mainstream science is refusing to allow some of Darwin's most important theories to fall. One of those is the theory of competition in nature. We have been led to believe from Darwin's theories that, that nature is based upon a model of violent competition and conflict. So, for example, Darwin would look at ants in nature. He would look at an anthill, and he would see that one nest of ants would capture another nest, but they didn't kill them, they enslaved them and made that colony work for them. And Darwin said, what I see here must be a small example of a law that applies to everyone. And he began to apply those ideas in his theories. Well, the result is, his book was published in 1859. Modern civilization, the world that we know, is largely based upon the belief that nature itself is modeled after survival of the strongest.
A jungle.
Is Darwin's language. Darwin called it survival of the strongest. Later it was called survival of the fittest. But Darwin's own words, he said survival of the strongest. So the economic system that is collapsing now in the world is based upon survival of the strongest. The corporate system that is having so much turmoil right now, the way we're solving our problems between nations in the Middle East and Africa, within our own countries, it's all based on a model that we now know is obsolete, because the new discoveries are showing us not only is nature not based upon competition, it is actually based upon a model of cooperation.
The good news right here. In the late 1990s, early 90s, and then it was published in the late 90s, over 400 scientific studies asked the same question. 400 studies said, what is the optimum amount of competition anywhere? In the classroom, in the playing field, in the workplace, in the home. What is the optimum amount of competition? All 400 studies came back with exactly the same answer, and the answer is 0. The ideal amount of violent competition in any environment, in the classroom, the workplace, the family, the playing field, is none. Violent competition always is destructive.
So when I look at my background in the industry with crises, I think I'm in the perfect place right now to bridge the wisdom of the past with the best science of today and marry those two ways of knowing, science and what we call spirituality, not religion, but spirituality, a deep understanding of our relationship to the earth.
That's a very good point of view, because you've been working as a geologist, and I was thinking, did this help you think about the electromagnetic field like in a different way, or that, I don't know, what happens to us connects a lot with the energies underneath?
As a geologist, I had the opportunity to study the earth itself through the language of the earth, rather than the interpretations of another scientist or another person. For example, almost universally, ancient texts and traditions all tell us that we could expect a time of great change in this lifetime. Not bad change, just big change. And my question, even as a child, how did they know? How did our ancestors know that we would live a time of such tremendous change? The answer to that question is that our ancestors understood the cycles and the rhythms of earth and nature and time. Modern science is only beginning to understand those rhythms and those cycles. So if we want to know realistically what we can expect in our world and in our lives, if we want to know about the changes of the earth, it makes tremendous sense to look into the records of the earth herself. And for me, as a geologist, that was a very natural language, looking at the ice cores of Antarctica, for example, the ice cores of Greenland, the seafloor sediment cores, and the tree ring history of the last few thousand years. We need only look at the records of the earth to really understand the cycles and to know where we are in the cycles and what we can expect and how we can adapt to the changes in our lives.
And these records say that whatever happens now happened before, or is unprecedented and we don't know what's going to happen?
It's a very delicate question. The records of the Earth's history from the ice cores right now go back about 420,000 years. We have very good records from the ice cores in Antarctica, very specifically an ice core that was drilled over Vostok Lake. It's called the Vostok Ice Core from 1999. And the Vostok core correlates well with other ice cores from Greenland and other parts of Antarctica. And what it shows is the rhythms of the warming and the cooling of the Earth, the rhythms of the increase and the decrease of greenhouse gases on the Earth. We see this through almost 500,000 years of Earth's history. If we want to know if Earth is broken, and if we have broken it, we can look to the ice cores of the past, and what we find is that we are in a time where we should experience warming on the Earth. It's expected because of where we are in the cycles. And from the cycles of the past, the warming that we're experiencing now is not anomalous. It is anomalous to us. No one in this generation has ever experienced the warming that we're seeing now.
Ooh, that's a relief. So it's not our fault.
Our parents didn't experience the warming. Our grandparents didn't experience the warming. It's been thousands of years since we've had this cycle that we're experiencing now. The question is whether or not we're causing the warming. And I think it's safe to say, as a scientist, that we are not the cause of the warming itself. We may have contributed to the warming through the addition of the greenhouse gases that we've created. But even before we created the greenhouse gases, it's very clear in the records of the past that we have been warmer than we are now, that the warming is intense, it's brief, and it is rhythmic, it is cyclic. And there are cycles within cycles. There are 100,000-year cycles. There are 50,000-year cycles. There are 21,000-year cycles, 12,000, 5,000-year cycles. So it depends on how finely we would like to divide the cycles. But the key is, if we really want to understand our relationship to the Earth, I think it's good to ask the questions and let the Earth give us the answers in terms of what has happened in the past. If we know where to look in the past, it gives us a very good understanding of where we are now and what we can expect in the future. One of the very interesting things and difficult questions that's been found is that when we look at the warming of the past, typically the temperatures warm first, and then the greenhouse gases accelerate after that. They increase after that. And there appears to be a lag time of around 400 to 800 years between the time the warming begins and when the greenhouse gases actually increase. So my question is, how can we solve the problems of our time unless we are honest about the information?
So when you were in school, when I was in school, if you have children in school today, they are still being taught false assumptions of science, even though we know they're no longer true. For example, evolution. We're being taught that evolution explains human life, even though the data no longer supports this. We're being taught that civilization is only about 5,000 years old, even though the archaeology is showing advanced civilization over 2 times this old. This is an amazing site. The site is still being excavated. It is an active site right now. It is now called the oldest advanced civilization anywhere in the world. It is a series of circular temples. Now, they have not even excavated to the very bottom. So far, where they have excavated, here is the dating. This site is now scientifically dated between 11,300 and 11,500 years before present. Scientifically dated. That's over twice as old as what's taught in the classrooms today. What I'm going to do is draw the great world age cycles on this map, and you'll see something very interesting. The dark lines are the great world age cycles. Here they are, right here. So here's today. This is the great world age cycle that we just finished. Here is the beginning of our cycle 5,000 years ago. Look at this. The history that you were taught and I was taught, the history here, it's not the history of the whole world forever. It's the history of one world age only.
If we are entering into a new normal of climate on Earth that is part of a natural cycle, it makes sense for us to learn to adapt to that cycle so that we are not caught off guard, that we're not surprised, that we can be resilient. And this is the word I think is very important.
And not live in blame.
Not live in blame, find resilience to the changes. Now, I have to be very clear when we have this conversation. We definitely need to wean ourselves from fossil fuels. I believe that. We definitely need to find clean, green, sustainable ways of providing power and energy and electricity to the people of the world. And the technology exists to do that. But when we ask ourselves about the carbon dioxide emissions and whether or not it is causing the warming. I think the data supports the fact that there's something else going on, and we owe it to ourselves to ask the question and to find that answer.
You are saying that the line between spirituality and science is getting fuzzy. Can this be confusing for some people?
The line between science and spirituality, I believe, is becoming very fuzzy. Yeah. And it's probably a good thing for this reason. Science is a relatively new way of exploring our world. Science, we say modern science began about 300 years ago during the time of Isaac Newton. When he formalized the laws of physics, we say that's the beginning of science. Some people say maybe even before. So for 300 years, we have depended upon science to tell us who we are, what is our relationship to the earth, to our bodies, to one another, to the past, to the future, how we solve our problems. And there are many people who are simply feeling left out of the conversation if they do not speak the language of science. Before science, we have 5,000 years of human history. And people ask me, did we know anything for 5,000 years? And the answer is yes. Our ancestors, they had a way of understanding who we are, our relationship to the earth, our relationship to one another. It wasn't scientific, but it worked for them. It answered their questions, and it helped them to solve their problems and to live their lives day in and day out. When science came along, we threw, the term is the baby out with the bathwater. We threw all of the information out and said, unless science can prove it, it doesn't exist. So where we find ourselves now is there are things happening in the world that science cannot yet explain, yet they still are happening. Quantum physics is becoming the bridge between the ancient wisdom, the spirituality, and the modern science, because quantum physics allows for fields of energy to connect our physical world and us with our physical world, and it allows for phenomenon that traditional physics does not allow for. So the quantum physics is actually becoming a very good bridge when it is honored and used well. We have to respect the parameters of quantum physics.
We all kind of feel that it's true, but we don't know how to prove it. Can quantum physics prove that, for instance, we are all connected and we can influence the world outside us?
Quantum physics has proven beyond any reasonable doubt that everything is connected to everything else.
This experiment, it was performed in Switzerland, University of Geneva, in July of 1997. 3,400 journalists were in the laboratory watching the experiment because it was so significant. Here is what happened. Atoms that make up our world are made of smaller particles called photons. A photon is a little particle of light. Just think of it that way. So a photon is the stuff this world is made of, okay? Scientists took one photon and they wanted to do an experiment, but they needed two identical photons, so they took one, they cut it in half to make two identical twins. Then they placed the two photons in a special chamber, and from that chamber there was one tube that went 7 miles in this direction, one tube that went 7 miles in this direction, and each photon they fired into the separate tubes. What the scientists found is whatever they did to one photon in one place, the other photon had the same experience even though it was 14 miles away. Well, the phenomenon is called entanglement. It's when two things were once together, then they become physically separate, however, the energy is still connected.
There really is no longer a question if the connection exists. The question now is how deep is the connection? How much influence do we have within that connection? How do we use that connection? This was the great debate in the 20th century between the great minds of physics. Albert Einstein, for example, this was a source of frustration for him, and even to his last day on this earth. He did not really like the ideas of quantum physics. He didn't like the idea that we could influence physical matter from one place while the matter is in another place. The term he used, he called it spooky action at a distance. I love that term.
Yeah.
He didn't like the idea that spooky action at a distance was possible. At the same time, a colleague of Albert Einstein's, Professor John Wheeler from Princeton University, they lived at the same time, they were colleagues, they were friends, they studied the same mathematics and had very different viewpoints on our relationship to the world. So while Albert Einstein believed that we were separate from the world, John Wheeler said that we are an integral part of the world. He said that we live in a universe that is still building itself. Exactly. He said that, and I love this about John Wheeler, he said that when we build the microscopes to look at the smallest elements of matter inside the quantum atom, and when we build the telescopes to look into the depths of space, what John Wheeler said was that we will never find the smallest particle of matter, and we'll never find the edge of the universe. He said because the act of us searching is an act of creation that will always place something there for us to see. Now, I have to think about that as a deep concept. He said the act of us looking, peering into the world with the expectation that we will see something is actually an act of creating something. And now our own science is beginning to help us understand how that is. The human heart is the strongest generator of electricity and magnetism in the human body. And our world is made of electrical and magnetic fields. So when we feel deeply with our heart, we're actually influencing. Now, I don't want to use the word control or manipulate. We're not imposing our will, but we have the ability now to actually interact with the world around us from a distance. And this is the very core of our most cherished and ancient spiritual traditions.
The Institute of Heart Math was able to document the existence of this field. So this is not a hypothetical field. This is not New Age. It's not the prana. It's not the aura. Although it may be connected to the prana and the aura, this is an electrical and a magnetic field that surrounds every human heart. It's shaped like a donut. It's called a torus. They built a special device, and they had human DNA, and they wanted really pure DNA. So this is DNA from placenta. It's isolated, and they wanted to see if an individual that has learned to regulate the emotions can change the shape of this DNA. The shape. Here's why that's important. What researchers have found is this: the DNA in the cells of your body does in fact change shape. In the presence of anger, hate, jealousy, rage, stress, those kinds of what we would call negative emotions, the DNA is compressed. It's wound up very, very tightly and compressed. And because it is wound tightly, it cannot express fully. So in the presence of anger, hate, jealousy, rage, your DNA is not able to fully function. But you know that. When people are living in stress, their health suffers. In the presence of positive emotions, gratitude, appreciation, love, and compassion, look at what happened with DNA. It actually relaxed.
For 300 years, science has told the story of separation. It's told us that life is completely random, human life is random, that we're separate from our bodies and powerless to have any effect on healing our bodies, that we're separate from the world around us, that civilization is only 5,000 years old, and we are at the pinnacle of sophistication, and that competition is the way to solve our problems. Those are now called false assumptions of science, 6 false assumptions. And the world that we have today is the result of those false assumptions. New discoveries have given us new reasons to change all of those. New discoveries are telling us that life itself, origin of life, it's not random, that human life is not random, that we're deeply connected to our bodies, we're deeply connected to the earth, civilization is cyclic, and nature is based upon cooperation. And if we can embrace those new truths as we solve the greatest crises, the biggest problems that we've ever been asked to face, then we open the door to a beautiful new world based upon sustainable ways of thinking and sustainable ways of living. And that's why I'm excited about this conversation.
Yes, you said something very that it struck me. You know?
I saw it.
You said something which most of us would consider a miracle, which is self-healing. Like, a lot of people still don't believe that there is such thing, and they need, again, they need proof. They need to have a neighbor who did that. They need to see it on TV, filmed in, you know, real time.
Sure.
They need proof to believe that. Why is that, and is it really possible?
When we look at our bodies and what our own science now is beginning to help us understand, it is very similar to what our most cherished and ancient indigenous and spiritual traditions have always said. What science is telling us is this, is that the cells in our bodies that determine our health respond to the chemistry released by the brain. And the chemistry released by the brain is triggered from the feelings in the human heart. What we know is that every moment of every day, there's a conversation between our heart and our brain. It's a two-way conversation. Our heart is sending signals to the brain, and based upon those signals, the brain releases chemistry into the body. When we feel frightened, angry, hate, jealousy, rage, frustration, that sends a very jagged, irregular signal to the brain, and it releases stress chemistry, which is good for a moment, but it's not good 24/7.
Do we see that? Do we see that jagged? Because that's what was
Yes.
another point of view. Like, how do we know it's like this? How do we sense it? Do we film it? Do we record it somehow?
The answer is yes to everything that you said. There's an organization called the Institute of Heart Math, HEARTMATH, but it's all one word. They're based in Northern California. I am not their employee, but I have worked closely with them for 20 years now. And they are pioneers in uncovering the deepest mysteries of the human heart in ways that conventional science does not. So conventional science says the heart pumps blood. Well, you can make a machine to do that, but what else does our heart do? So the Institute of Heart Math, to answer your question, has documented this the information between the heart, and you can actually see the information between the heart and the brain when we feel feelings of well-being, appreciation, gratitude, compassion, care. Then the signal is a very smooth, rhythmic signal to our brain, and our brain says, the world is safe, so I don't need the stress chemistry. So it begins to release the anti-aging hormones in our bodies, and powerful immune response is created within our bodies in the presence of this smooth signal. The connection is called coherence, heart-brain coherence. And optimum coherence now has been measured. It's a very low frequency, 0.10 hertz. That is the language that whales communicate in the oceans. It's a very low frequency. So if we can create the feelings in our hearts, for example, of 0.10 hertz, that is an optimum connection between our heart and our brain, and that begins releasing the healing chemistry from our brain into the cells of our bodies, and this has been documented. It reduces high blood pressure, reduces vascular plaque, reduces the chances for stroke. When we are able to feel those kinds of feelings sustained over long periods of time, the immune system increases. The DHEA level is the precursor to all hormones in the body. Every hormone must have the DHEA. DHEA increases 100% from only 3 minutes of feeling the feelings: appreciation, gratitude, compassion, love, while the stress chemistry decreases 23% in the same time, and all we're doing is having a feeling. Those are the qualities that the body needs to begin to heal itself.
There is a woman that comes into the room for healing. The healer is on one side of the wall. The woman receiving the healing is on the other side of the wall. The two women have never met. They have never spoken. The woman being healed has no idea who is on the other side of the wall. Time equals 0. This is the inflamed cyst on the ovary. 3 minutes later, look at what happens. Time equals 3. The tumor is shrinking. Time equals 7. 7 minutes later, the tumor no longer exists. It's gone. What's happening in the brain of the woman doing the healing? The scientists are scanning the brain. So let's look at the brain scan. The healing is beginning to happen. What is happening in the brain of the healer? Watch this. The left and the right brain, something very interesting happens. Look at this. Look at this. The left brain, the logic, the thinking is becoming so inactive it doesn't even register. Look at the white. But the right brain links us with intuition, with emotion, with feeling, and look at what happens in the right brain. It's beginning, look at this, it goes from the blue to the green to the yellow. Look at this. Now the right brain is really active. What's happening in the left brain? Not very much. That is the answer. The left brain is very inactive. But look at what's happening to the woman's body. So whatever is happening between these two women, the healer is not using her left brain. She's not thinking, tumor, go away. She's not thinking, healing, be healed. She's not doing that. This suggests she's not thinking much at all. But she has activated her right brain, which is directly linked to the heart. The right brain and the heart are directly linked.
So our bodies are designed to heal themselves. And our own science now has shown every organ in every cell, every organ in our body has now been documented with the potential to heal itself. Even organs we were told could not heal themselves. Brain tissue, heart tissue, spinal cord tissue, pancreatic tissue, all has been documented at regeneration and healing under the right conditions and the right environment. So the thinking of science is that the environment must come from a pill or a machine.
Exterior.
Mm-hmm. Our most cherished traditions always told us that we had the ability to do this for ourselves, but science didn't really understand that. And now science is beginning to validate that we may create within our own bodies, through the power of emotion, heart-based emotion, the very experiences that begin healing the human body.
Have you ever tried it on yourself?
I will share with you a story. The answer is yes. In the year 2000, I went for an annual physical, and my doctor told me that I had a growth inside of my bladder that should not be there, and needed to come out quickly. He scheduled surgery. And in the fall of 2000, I went into the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida, and underwent the anesthetic, went into the operating room for the full procedure. But here's what happened in between. Before I went into the doctor, I had studied all my life ancient traditions, ancient texts in the monasteries of Tibet and Bolivia and Peru. And I said, now, if I were ever going to apply these in my life, now is the time. So when my doctor gave me the diagnosis, I said, give me 2 weeks to work with myself. And I did everything that I'd been taught to do. But still, I had the doubt in my mind. So I went to the hospital. I went to the procedure. I woke up in the recovery room, and the doctor said, why are you here? He said, there's nothing inside of you to remove. He said,
you weren't operated at all?
He said, they used a scope. Okay, so they used the anesthetic. They put me under. They used a scope, and the scope showed that there was no reason to operate. There was nothing there. He says, why are you here?
Wow.
And I was still under anesthetic, and I tried to tell him about what I'd learned. It didn't work.
You have the chance now. What did you do?
Well, this is, I think, why it was good for me to have the experience, because I had studied all of the traditions, and I knew it was possible. But because I had the experience myself, I can look you in the eye, I can look at our listeners and our viewers, and I can say, I had this experience, and I know it's possible. And I also know that it may not be easy, because when our body has an illness or a disease, we lose the faith in our body. We lose trust. And we must work to overcome that. And I think it's the greatest lesson for any of us to learn, because once we discover that we have that ability, we feel differently about life and our friends and our families, and we feel differently about our relationship to the world. So I can look at you and say, what I did was all the things that I'd learned to do to create the coherence, the heart-brain coherence, to heal the anger, to heal the hurt, heal the frustration, create the coherence between my heart and my brain to the best of my ability throughout the day. I did it as many times as I could. And I cannot say that is the only reason. As a scientist, I have to say I think it was a factor in the healing that I experienced. I
know there are experiments that started in the 1990s. I mean, it's where, you know better, you know, but in Russia or...
Russia started in the 60s. In the 1960s, the Russians were ahead of other countries in the West, acknowledging, first, even exploring the possibility. To make the experiment, you must ask the question. And because most scientists were taught the false assumptions, the 6 false assumptions, that we're separate from our bodies, that we're separate from the world, that consciousness has no effect on the world around us. They don't even ask the question. So in the 1960s, I know the former Soviet Union, the cosmonauts, were doing experiments from space with telepathy, for example. That's only possible through a field that connects all things. So I'm not saying that we understand everything. What I'm saying is that new discoveries that are not shared in the classroom or in the mainstream media now are opening the door to new possibilities to give us new ways to think about ourselves and our relationship to the world. Personal healing is a part of that.
Yeah, but people have a problem understanding and accepting this. Like, even I was talking to someone, you know, preparing for this interview. I was giving the example with Poponin, you know, who had that experiment with human. You tell it. You know it better.
Well, if I understand the experiment that you're
human DNA, yeah,
you're talking about, what the scientists did was they took particles of light that are called photons, and if our viewers are not familiar with a photon, it's the stuff that atoms are made of. So the scientists were able to take the building blocks of atoms that our world, our bodies are made of, and they put them into a vacuum. So they took all the air out of this container, and they measured to see where are they, what is the distribution, and it was random. They were everywhere, just what they expected. The next part of the experiment is they took human DNA and placed the human DNA into the vacuum with the photons. Now, to even think to do that experiment tells me that science
Had a question.
is on the edge of a big discovery, to even think to do that. So what happened was they put the DNA in with the photons, then they said, what is the distribution?
What effect do we have on the stuff our world is made of? Conventional science says we have no effect. But here's what the experiment is showing. All of a sudden, the photons align themselves along the DNA. Now, that is an amazing experiment, because what it's saying is this. It's saying that the stuff you are made of, your DNA, has a direct effect on the stuff the world is made of, the photons of the atoms of matter. And that was the first time it was shown under controlled conditions in the laboratory. Very controversial, very interesting.
So that was the laboratory. The question is, how far does that effect extend into the real world? And this is where the scientists now are doing experiments to see if it's only localized in one place, how far something like this actually goes. So that was an example, and you were giving that example. But yes, it is difficult for many people to embrace the idea that we could possibly influence the healing of our bodies, or that we could possibly influence the peace in a community, or the peace between nations. But the experiments are showing very, very clearly that this is in fact a possibility under the right conditions. And the reason it's possible, it all goes back to the proof that we are in fact connected by a field of energy. 1944, Max Planck, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, he made a statement. It was so profound. He said, what we see as matter doesn't really exist the way we think it exists. He said, behind everything we see as matter, he said, there is a conscious and intelligent mind that is the matrix. That was his word. The matrix of all matter. John Wheeler, Princeton University, bore that out through his experiments. John Wheeler said that the universe is not complete, that it is us. The act of consciousness is constantly interacting with the fields around us, creating our reality, essentially. The good things that happen, the bad things that happen.
So we can actually create our life in every moment, and we can change everything that happens to us in every second?
Theoretically, I think it's possible. The problem is that we say with our words, I would like to change, but in our hearts and our minds, we have the fear and the doubt that prevents that change. And this is where the real workshop of life begins.
You said at some point that we can literally move mountains. And you've been around the world, you've seen many, many powerful things and many proofs with your own eyes. How can we do that? This is another very strong, thing that most of us wouldn't think it's possible. We all think it's literally impossible.
What quantum physics is now suggesting, and what our most cherished indigenous and ancient spiritual traditions have always said, is the world around us is nothing more, nothing less than a mirror of what we accept as our reality. So if we accept the suffering, if we accept the hurt and the pain, if we accept war as the reality, then we can certainly continue to experience that. When we claim the cooperation and the peace that is actually the model that nature is based upon, then that becomes a new reality. The key is to collectively, this is a collective choice that we must have, and that I think this is what we're exploring now.
There are 2 satellites above the northern hemisphere. Every 30 minutes, they send a signal to the scientists of the Earth, and they tell us how strong the magnetic field of the Earth is. Now, the magnetic field of the Earth is important. The magnetic field of the Earth connects all life. It sustains all life. There is no them and us when it comes to the magnetic field of the Earth. There is only we. Every blade of grass, every hamster, every goldfish, every dog, every cat, every CEO of every corporation, every leader of every nation is connected to the magnetic field of the Earth. One day scientists were looking at the information and all of a sudden, boom, look at this. They'd never seen the magnetic field do this before. And the scientists say, what on earth? What on earth is happening on Earth to create this spike in the magnetic field? So they took the data and they overlaid it onto a calendar of days and months. That arrow is on the graph at a point that is 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, September 11th, 2001. The first plane hit the first tower of the World Trade Center, September 11th, about 8:45 a.m. approximately. Scientists believe it took about 15 minutes for the images of the tragedy to travel around the world through the media, through the television signals and the satellites. And at 9 a.m., when the spike happened, scientists now believe that this is a spike that is the result of the collective emotion of hundreds of millions of humans feeling in their heart, not thinking, feeling the shock of the emotion, of the tragedy. And for the first time, scientists were able to document hundreds of millions of people in a moment in time sharing a heart-based experience had the power to actually shift the magnetic field of the Earth that connects and sustains all life. And the scientists said, oh my God.
You came to Romania for a conference. You came here to deliver a message. What is what you are expecting to leave behind?
Many of the things that we're talking about now, I'll be sharing with the audience, but the key is this. The world changed, and no one told us. There has been no special on the BBC network or CNN network or the Discovery Channel or the History Channel that has said to the world, looks the world in the eye and says, the world of the past that you knew 10 years ago no longer exists. And this is important for this reason. We've never had the opportunity to let that world go, to mourn and release the world of the past. So many people are clinging to the idea of the old world, and they're trying to get that world back, the world of the economy of 5 years ago. That's not possible any longer. The global debt will prevent that. The world of the inexpensive energy, the cheap energy of 10 years ago, that's not possible because we've reached the peak oil. These are just examples. The food and the water that we're now competing for in some parts of the world, the way we're solving the problems in Egypt and Iran and Syria and Israel and the West Bank, all of these things. Those are all real-life examples of precisely what we're talking about, unsustainable ways of dealing with everyday life based on science, false assumptions of science, competition, violent competition and separation. So now that those events are right in our face, we have to deal with them. We have new opportunities and new solutions, but many people simply don't know about the discoveries. So I will be sharing the new science that's so new. It's not in the textbooks, it's not in the classrooms, it's not in the mainstream media, but it's important in our lives. And it's important because it gives us the tools to adapt. Adapt, not force the world back to the way that it used to be, rather to adapt to the new normal that is emerging in healthy, thriving ways so that we can embrace the new opportunities that are happening right now. Resilience, personal resilience, and community resilience is the key, and that is part of the message that I'll be sharing.
Not everybody will have the chance to get to your conference, unfortunately, but if there's one thing that each of us can do at home, like starting from now, each of the people watching you to change their life or not to change their life, to adapt, or what would that be?
That's a very good question. Based upon the false science of the past that led us to believe we live in a world of separation, we each have asked ourselves a question every day, consciously or subconsciously. When we enter a relationship, a job, a career, make a big decision, the question is, what can I get from the world that exists? That's the question. What can I get? What's in it for me? Now the question must change. Science tells us we live in a world that's connected, and it's based upon cooperation. So the new question becomes, what can I give, or what can I share? What can I contribute? What can I offer to the world that's emerging? When we make that shift from what can I get from the world that exists to what can I give to the world that's emerging, it changes everything. It opens new doors of possibility. Can I just give an example?
Yes, please.
It opens new doors of possibility. We all know the economy is having a difficult time, and people are losing jobs, industries are disappearing. So I'm going to give an example along those lines. My wife and I live in a rural community in northern New Mexico in the United States. A friend of ours, in 2008, when the economy collapsed, he was building homes. His job was to build homes, ecologically friendly homes. He had a crew of about 30 people working for him. In 2008, the economy collapsed. He lost his job. All of the people he was responsible for, they had no job. He said, what am I going to do? And he asked himself, what can I give to the world that's emerging? What does the world need? He said, the world doesn't need houses anymore. They can't afford them. He said, but what they need is a way to grow food. He said, I'm a builder. But rather than building houses, I'm going to build raised modular gardens of all sizes that people can have to grow their own food. People in New York that have no yard, their garden is 1 foot by 1 foot in the kitchen.
So
counter.
do we.
Okay. People that live in big areas, we have 2 of these gardens that are 8 feet by 4 feet. They have their own watering system. They have their own heating system. They're raised above the ground. They have covers that 12 months out of the year, when the temperatures are 20 degrees below zero, the food continues to grow. And he now is building raised bed gardens to teach people how to grow their own food locally, rather than have the carbon footprint of growing the food halfway around the world, putting it in a 747, flying it across the ocean, and then trucking the food that sometimes is contaminated. They grow their own food locally now, and they share it with their neighbors. It's building community, and he is so happy building these gardens. He will never build homes again because he feels good about what he's doing. He answered the question, what can I give to the world that's emerging? The world didn't need homes, but the world does need to grow food. So this is one example.
You know, time that doesn't exist in quantum physics has just flown. And thank you very much for your presence here.
This was a very fast interview.
Very fast,
the time went by fast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again in Romania. Vă mulțumesc foarte mult, doamnelor și domnilor, și vă doresc să aveți o seară minunată.